Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 643 of the People Behind the Science podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Marie McNeely, and February is Black History Month, listeners, and we are celebrating by highlighting the work and the stories of some brilliant Black scientists. In this episode, we are revisiting our conversation with Dr. Cullen Buie, originally published on March 6th of 2017. Listeners, Cullen is an accomplished engineer who studies flow physics at microscopic scales. His research has wide-ranging applications, including biofuels, energy storage, and bacterial infections. And Cullen shared some excellent stories about his life and his research in our interview, so listeners, get ready for this episode of People Behind the Science.
Every day, discoveries are made that will change our understanding of the world around us. Dr. Marie McNeely is here to bring you the brilliant minds who are making these discoveries so they can share their incredible stories and take you on an amazing journey. Welcome to People Behind the Science.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to People Behind the Science. Today, our guest is Dr. Cullen Buie. So, Cullen, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm doing great. We got snow up here in Boston, so I'm just glad to be inside.
Ooh, fantastic. I'm a little jealous. We don't have much snow here in St. Louis. It gave us a little sprinkle last week, but not much more than that.
Well, if you ever want a donation, Boston, we can donate you some snow.
I know who to call.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, I'm excited to have you on our show today, and I'm excited to introduce you to our listeners. So let me take a moment here to give them some background. Listeners, Cullen is an associate professor and the Esther and Harold E. Egerton Career Development Professor in the Department of Mechanical Engineering at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He received his bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the Ohio State University, and he attended Stanford University, where he received his master's and his Ph.D. in mechanical engineering. Afterwards, Cullen was awarded a University of California President's Postdoctoral Fellowship to conduct research at the University of California-Berkeley. And Cullen joined the faculty at MIT in 2010. And now he has received many awards and honors throughout his career, including the Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, the DARPA Young Faculty Award, the DuPont Young Professor Award, and the NSF CAREER Award. Now, in addition, Cullen was named a Stanford Distinguished Alumni Scholar, and in 2016, he was named one of the 100 most influential African Americans by The Root. And listeners, Cullen is here with us today to talk about his life and science. So Cullen, today we want to get to know you both as an engineer and as a human being. So can you start by telling us what you like to do when you're not doing science and engineering?
I'm married and I have 3 children, so I like to sleep when I get a chance to sleep, because sleep is at a premium in my house. But no, seriously, I really like comedy. So when I have time, I watch a lot of and attend stand-up comedy. That's something I've been into for a little while. I'm also a big sports fan. So as you said, I went to the Ohio State University and I'm a huge college football fan. So in the fall, on a Saturday, you can find me in front of the TV watching the Buckeyes.
Oh, absolutely. I grew up in Ohio, so I'm a Buckeyes fan myself. So.
Uh-oh. Where'd you grow up?
Up near Cleveland.
I'm from Shaker Heights.
Gotcha. Small world. This is fantastic. So now you mentioned that you are a comedy fan. Do you have a favorite comedian?
These days, I really love Jim Gaffigan, and his obsession with food really resonates with me.
That's awesome. Well, Cullen, it's great to get a window into your life outside of science and some of the things that excite you and interest you, and to hear a little bit more about your family. But I do want to talk about your scientific side next. So can you tell us how you describe your work to someone who's not at all familiar with your field?
My group, we look at putting foreign nucleic acids, or DNA, into cells. So cells being mammalian cells, or more recently, almost exclusively bacteria. This is a way you can essentially reprogram bacteria to do things of use for mankind. I'll give an analogy that I think helps a little bit. So you buy a smartphone, let's say you buy an iPhone, and that phone has some hardware in it and a limited amount of software. But one of the things that makes it powerful is that you can download all these applications or apps from the web. So as soon as you can get it connected to Wi-Fi or to a data connection, you could download more functionality. So you can download Uber, or you can download Facebook or Google Maps, or any number of additional programs that just make your phone more powerful. That's essentially what we try to do with bacteria. So bacteria and microbes, they have some genetic machinery that allows them to make proteins and amino acids and all kinds of things that are suitable for life, but they can also make a lot of other things of interest to mankind. And so you can, by uploading foreign DNA, that's like uploading the code for a new app to get those microbes or bacteria to make new stuff for you. And my group enables that by opening holes in bacteria and putting foreign DNA in.
That's fantastic. Well, Cullen, I love this analogy you use, relating it to an iPhone and all this extra technology, all this kind of extra functionality you can get out of it by pulling those apps in. So I'm excited to chat more about this project as we go through our interview. But I do want to talk a little bit about what motivates you. I think as a scientist, as you kind of alluded to, sleep is a premium. You've got a lot to do in a day. Do you have a favorite saying or a quote that you use to keep you motivated and keep you going?
I'll give two. So the first is from the Bible, actually. It's Philippians 4:6-7. It says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation, by prayer and petition, with thanksgiving, present your requests to God, and the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus." And this has been important to me for a while. I became a Christian in college, so I didn't grow up as a person of faith, but it's something that came a little bit later. Incidentally, I kind of discovered engineering and discovered Christianity at almost the same time. And I tend to be an anxious person. So this message of not being anxious, but relying on prayer and relying on God has really been important and resonated with me throughout my life and the many anxious moments that we all have, be they professional or personal. And so that's certainly one that has been around for me for a while. And the other quote is from Master Yoda, "Do or do not, there is no try." And
I like it.
I like that one because it's just simple and to the point. And I think that's how I try to live my life. Well, that's how I live my life. It's not how I try.
Right. I think it's hard to take that try out of your vocabulary.
Yeah, it is. But I love the principle that's in it, even though it's from Star Wars.
Absolutely. Well, I love these two quotes, and we'll put them on our website if our listeners are looking for a little extra inspiration today. And now we've talked a little bit about your work and some of the things that you do. And I think the people that you encounter along the way as you go through your journey as a scientist can have a big impact on what you do. So, Cullen, when you look back, are there people who really stick out in your mind as those who maybe inspired you or served as role models?
I'll give two here. One is from my time as an undergraduate. Dr. Gregory Washington, who was on the faculty in mechanical engineering at Ohio State at the time. He's currently the Dean of Engineering at University of California, Irvine. And I remember he gave a talk my freshman year to a group known as the National Society of Black Engineers. He was African-American. I'm also African-American. And just to be blunt, there really aren't that many African-American mechanical engineering professors. At Ohio State, he was the only one. At MIT, I'm one of two. There just aren't a lot. And I remember being at this meeting for the National Society of Black Engineers, and he was talking about academic excellence and his path to getting a Ph.D. And it was very inspiring to me. And I remember at the end of the meeting, he said very directly to all the students, if you're a mechanical engineer and you're in this room, you need to get to know me. And I was planning to major in mechanical engineering. And so I took him up on that offer. And my freshman year started just checking in. I would come into his office and tell him how classes were going and get to know him a little bit. And my sophomore year, early in the term, my sophomore year, he offered me a job in his laboratory as an undergraduate research assistant. Now, this was in 2000. And at that time, undergraduate research wasn't nearly as popular as it is today. Today, probably 70, 80% of students do some kind of undergraduate research. Back then, they were just starting to really emphasize it. Mm-hmm. And so when he offered undergraduate research, I didn't even know what research was, but I did know I wanted a job. And so I took the job and I said, well, I don't know what research is, but I do know what money is and I need a job. And worst case scenario is I gain some skills and maybe I figure out I don't like research, but at least it knocks something off the table. It turns out I really did like it and had a little bit of proficiency at it. And I would absolutely not be a professor today if it weren't for his mentorship. I mean, he came to my wedding. He encouraged me to get a PhD. It's hard to understate the influence he had on my life. And then the second would be my PhD advisor at Stanford, Juan Santiago, just a very prolific scientist and just great at what he does and has students all over the world who are now in academia and further inspired me to go the academic route with my career.
Wonderful. It's great to hear about these two inspirational mentors that you had in your career kind of at different points. And I love this experience that you mentioned as an undergraduate getting involved in research. So can you tell us, what was your experience like? Were you the dishwasher or were you actually kind of manning your own project?
I was actually doing my own project. We were making a walking robot that used something known as shape memory alloys So this isn't research that I still do, but we were using this material that has two chemical states such that at low temperatures, it's relatively pliable, but then at high temperatures, it becomes very stiff. And so you can use this property to actuate small machines. And so I built a little robot that use these wires almost like muscles. And I was advised by a senior grad student at the time, but I did a lot of the work in building this little robot. He didn't just give me a project of, okay, my graduate student needs someone to machine his parts.
Right. Here are the instructions, put it together. Yeah.
It wasn't grunt work.
That's awesome. Well, fantastic to hear that you had this early experience, but did your curiosity or your interest in science and engineering start even before undergraduate?
To be honest, not really. And I know that might sound bad. I might be a little atypical. I feel as if sometimes I found my path late. I read a lot of graduate school applications now. So I've been on the admissions committee at MIT in my department for a couple of years. And a lot of the applications start with, from the age of 4, I was a tinkerer and I loved Legos.
Right.
And I read them like, man, that wasn't me.
You didn't like Legos? Come on, Cullen.
Not that I didn't like them, but I was more into sports. I played basketball and I played football my senior year of high school. And if you'd have asked me 25 years ago, what are you going to be doing? It would have been something athletic. Even though I wasn't a very good athlete, I was totally delusional, but that was my perspective. It just so happens that I had some aptitude in science and engineering and took AP classes. So all those doors were open for me later, but I never had an intention of using those abilities. It kind of fell upon me later.
Gotcha. So when you went to college, were you already sort of picking out your major within science and engineering, or was that something that you kind of came upon that decision later?
Well, that is a great question, which leads us to another story. If you could humor me for another story.
Yeah.
My senior year, I really had no idea what I was going to major in. And I think I told Ohio State I would be pre-med. And that was largely because my sister was going to medical school. Really, I was undecided. So I have a younger brother who was going to Ohio State for a football camp. So he was visiting Ohio State from Cleveland for a week-long football camp. My dad suggested that I come down with him to meet some people since I didn't know what I was going to major in. And there was an Office of Minority Affairs, and someone in that office, Tony Ramirez Miracle, wanted to meet me because an organization I was in high school had been written up in Newsweek, and she saw my picture and she wanted to meet me. And so I came down to Ohio State the last day of my brother's football camp with my father to meet this woman in the Office of Minority Affairs. While there, she tells me about engineering. And she says, well, you have a strong background in mathematics and in chemistry and physics. Have you ever considered engineering? And the answer was no. In fact, as a 17-year-old, before going into college, I had no idea what engineering was. It wasn't on the radar. I was ignorant. And they then sent me to the College of Engineering to talk to people there. I spoke to a woman named Minnie McGee, who's another person who's been extremely influential in my life. And she told me that they had a program where you could come into Ohio State before your freshman year, take some classes, kind of a bridge program, and decide if engineering was right for you and kind of get a head start on your engineering education. You wouldn't get formal credit, but you would kind of get a preview of engineering classes. And so she accepted me into this program right on the spot. Other people had to apply in advance. She accepted me right on the spot for a program that started in 2 days. This was a Friday. The program started on Sunday.
Oh, my gosh.
So we grabbed my brother. We drive back up to Cleveland, and I turned right back around and start in this program at Ohio State called Preface. And that's what started my journey into engineering. It was picking up my brother from a football camp.
Well, that is a fantastic story. And it's amazing how these almost serendipitous meetings with people can completely change the trajectory of your career.
Yeah, who knows what would have happened to me if I hadn't gone down. It would have been a simple enough decision to say, no, I'm not going to go.
I'm just going to stay home this weekend. Yeah.
I'm just going to stay home. Like, why am I going to take this 2-hour drive? But I think that goes to show people make the world go round. Every beneficial opportunity, almost everyone I've ever had, there's a person attached to it. And so if you treat people right and expose yourself to people and to community, just good things happen.
Definitely. Well, and I think this is a wonderful example of, you're right, making these connections and the importance of networking, putting yourself out there and talking to people about different things, not only to learn if you're interested, but to leverage some of these opportunities that you maybe didn't even know exist. So fantastic to hear some of these stories. And I'm curious, Cullen, to hear a little bit more about the next steps of your career. So we've talked a little bit about your experiences in undergrad and one of these influential mentors who encouraged you to go into a PhD program. Can you talk about kind of these next steps that you took that helped you get to your position that you're at today?
So I was very reluctant to come to academia. I've been maybe reluctant all along the way. I didn't know I was going to be an engineer, and then I decided I liked engineering, and I met Dr. Washington and got into research. I thought in undergraduate that I would probably get an MBA, and Dr. Washington essentially convinced me that I should at least consider getting a master's in engineering. So I went to Stanford, really only committed to getting a master's. And while I was there, I started doing some research with Juan Santiago, who I mentioned earlier, and the research was on fuel cells, and I was very interested in alternative energy. The only way to keep doing what I was doing, which I enjoyed, was to stay for a Ph.D. So the only reason I got a Ph.D. was to keep doing what I was doing.
Mm-hmm. Because you had to.
It wasn't to be a professor.
Yeah.
There was no career down the line I was aspiring for. This is how I stay at Stanford now. If you've ever been to Stanford, it's kind of a nice place to get stuck. So I wasn't in a hurry to get out of there.
Certainly. So
that's really why I got a PhD. It wasn't to be an academic. Then all along the way, though, all my mentors, and of course, Dr. Washington and others were saying, you should consider being a professor. You should be a professor. I got married and my wife was like, you really be good as a professor. You should be a professor. And I explored probably everything that I could, every other option. I looked at industry. I did an internship in a national lab. I looked at startup companies. I looked at consulting. I remember going on a consulting recruiting trip. And this particular consulting firm flew out a bunch of PhD students and MDs to tell them about getting into consulting. And I remember going on this trip. This was maybe my fourth year as a graduate student, and coming back and thinking, I really don't want to do that. And I turned to my wife one day and said, I think I should be a professor. And I know she wanted to slap me because she'd been saying that for years.
Right. The I told you so moment.
Yeah. It's like those cartoons where the guy that thinks he's a leader is told 10 times by the other person, we should go left. And then 5 minutes later, it's like, we should go left.
Have you considered left? Yes.
As if it were an original thought. So it took some time, but I eventually decided, I think academia is a place where I'm going to be able to integrate most of my skills, talents, and passions. And I didn't have very high expectations. I don't know, maybe I had a warped view of myself, maybe too low, or I don't, who knows. But I applied and it went very well. I mean, I'm at MIT. I've been extremely fortunate, but it took a while to figure out what I was going to do.
Yeah. So you mentioned this opportunity of being a professor, pursuing this career path would allow you to pursue all of your passions. Were there other deciding factors that really sealed the deal for you since you did quite a bit of shopping around?
I really like working at the cutting edge, and I like working with people that are smarter than me. So being at MIT, that's really easy because it's like everybody. So I like this very stimulating environment. Stanford really got me hooked on that, of really being at the cutting edge and pushing something forward. I love being in the lab or talking to one of my students about an experiment or about something we've seen in the world. And for that moment, we're the only person that knows this. It's like we have this little secret. It's like, wow, look what we just learned. And now we get to go tell everybody else about it. I get a kick out of that. And academia is one of the best places to get that kind of work.
Absolutely. So it's been great to hear more about your career path to get to your current position. But I do want to hear more about some of these projects that you have going on in the lab. So Cullen, do you have a favorite project that you have going on right now that you want to tell us about?
A favorite? Oh, they're like your children. How can I pick one?
Right.
I'll give one or two examples. So one, this is something that's occurred recently. So my group works on getting genetic material into microbes mainly. But what I found is, as I've gone around the country and really around the world telling people about the technologies we've been developing, a lot of people ask, have you tried mammalian cells? Have you tried T cells? Or have you tried stem cells? And to date, we really haven't. We've mostly focused on bacteria and other microbes. But recently, in a collaboration with a colleague who's here at MIT, Jacqueline Niles, who's in our biological engineering department, he'd been asking me if we could try some things related to malaria. And this was attractive to me just because malaria is such a huge problem globally. And to think about the potential impact if we're able to do something beneficial in that area would just be very satisfying to feel like we could really change and save a lot of lives. So there's a challenge in the study of malaria, which is that the parasite lives within red blood cells. So in order to perform genetics on the malaria parasite, you have to get those nucleic acids I was talking about. You have to get them first through the red blood cell and then into the parasite. So the current state of the art is that you put your foreign nucleic acids into the red blood cell when it's uninfected, and then you infect it with the parasite, and the parasite naturally kind of scavenges around the cell looking for things to uptake, and it can uptake this DNA. But it does this 1 in a million or 1 in 10 million cells.
Oh, wow.
So the efficiency is terribly low. Mm-hmm. And so if you want to, for example, perform a parametric study, or you want to create a library of malaria parasites where you've knocked out various genes and you want to understand how those genes function or understand how they affect something like drug resistance, it's just terribly slow. It's terribly slow because you can only get 1 in 10 million to uptake this foreign material. So what my group has been developing, and we have some data suggesting maybe we're onto something, we have a way of doing the transformation with the parasite in the red cell at what looks like much higher efficiency, orders of magnitude higher efficiency. And so this could lead to just some very fundamental advances in our understanding of how the parasite works, and hopefully to develop drugs and other therapeutics for down the line. So that's something we're excited about now. It's very preliminary, but I don't mind talking about it.
Gotcha. So is there, do you think, a way that through these methods that you're using that you could actually inactivate the parasite?
Possibly. I don't know that would be a viable treatment, because what you would need to do is something like dialysis. You need to take out all of the person's blood and then get it back in. Perhaps you could find a way of genetically engineering a version of the parasite that attacks others, or maybe there's a clinical route there. But I think most of the application is just fundamental. So in pathogenesis or in disease, if you can do genetics on the organism that is causing the virulence, it just accelerates our understanding of how it works just much faster, because you can figure out what genes lead to virulence and then target those genes or their phenotypes with chemotherapies or with drugs.
Gotcha. Well, this is phenomenal work, and really interesting to hear how you're almost moving into these biological applications from this mechanical engineering background. I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I've just been drifting around. You hear my background. I did a Ph.D. in fuel cells. If you looked at my Ph.D. thesis, you would not guess the things I'm doing now. Matter of fact, usually when I tell people what my group is doing, they assume I'm in a bioengineering department. Mm-hmm. But one great thing about MIT, so just a shout out to MIT, they don't care what you work on as long as it's good. No one has ever looked at me and said, oh, you're a mechanical engineer, you can't work on that. It's all about, do you have good ideas? Are you hardworking? Are you resourceful? If so, go and do it.
That's awesome. And I understand you have some projects looking at microbes as fuel cells, which is really cool and sort of an application that I wouldn't have thought of. So can you tell us what makes a microbe a good candidate to be a fuel cell or to be used in your research?
So when I was at Berkeley, I started getting into this area, this microbial fuel cells. So a fuel cell works, you add air and fuel, often hydrogen or a hydrocarbon, and you get useful energy, waste heat, and water. A microbial fuel cell does this using microbes as the catalyst. So a traditional chemical fuel cell might use ceramic if it's very high temperature, or if it's a low temperature fuel cell, might use platinum to catalyze the reactions that give you your useful electrical energy. A microbial fuel cell does this by essentially exploiting the fact that there are some bacteria that can respire. They essentially breathe on an electrode. They can actually conduct an electron from inside their body to outside, and that completes their respiration process. And you can then harvest that electron as useful electricity. And so a microbial fuel cell is using those organisms as catalysts. The reason you would want to do that is the diversity of fuel that they can take up is much wider. The main place where people have looked at this is in wastewater treatment. So wastewater treatment in the United States accounts for about 3% of energy consumption, but the energetic content or the energetic potential of the wastewater itself is about 10x what it takes to process it. So if you were able to harvest some of that useful energy, you could imagine wastewater treatment facilities that were neutral in terms of energy consumption, or perhaps even energy producers. And so that's the motivation behind using microbes as a fuel cell. You can actually use them to process wastewater, where you'll remove some of the organic material from the wastewater while also getting some useful electrical energy.
Gotcha. Well, fantastic to hear about these amazing research projects you're doing. I think though, so far we've talked about a lot of the exciting elements of your career, and we haven't really talked about some of the challenges and struggles and the downsides of life as a scientist, but I know they exist. So Cullen, can you take us back to a moment where you had a major failure or a really big struggle, and tell us how you worked through it to continue on to be a successful scientist?
Well, I've actually never had any major failures.
Of course not.
No, I'm just playing. So it started maybe as soon as I decided I was really going to start getting serious about science. One was in graduate school, my very first term at Stanford. So as you kind of progress through science, the stakes keep getting higher and everyone around you keeps getting smarter. And I had done well at Ohio State, and then I go to Stanford, and you're competing with people who have done well, not just at their university, but perhaps nationally. Some of the best people in the world in these graduate programs. And I remember my first term taking a fluid mechanics class at Stanford and getting the first homework assignment. And the homework assignment at the top, it said review and more. And looking at the problems, I couldn't tell which ones were review and which ones were more, because they all looked like more to me. I was basically behind compared to where they expected you to be. And I really, really struggled in that class. I really struggled in, I would say, all of my classes that first term. And in graduate school, an A is like kind of what you're supposed to get. Most people get an A, and a B plus is kind of like a B or a C, and a B is bad. Mm-hmm. And I had all B's and B pluses my first term. I remember distinctly coming back home for winter break and kind of polishing off my resume, thinking I'm not going to make it out of here. So I should maybe start looking for a job. But what happened is I realized there were just some maybe very small study habits I just didn't quite have. And I started talking to other people. I started getting a little bit more into my research. And as I did that, I started making friends in my advisor, Juan Santiago's research lab. And they just gave me tips on how to study and how to find a good study group and what things to work through and just how to think about my classes. And things progressively got better. And I also realized that there was a dynamic that was happening, which was that maybe half of the graduate population was international students, and their bachelor's degrees are in many ways the equivalent of what a master's degree is like in the United States. I remember being in a class and working on a particular homework problem, and I was in a study group, so that was good. But I showed a guy my answer, and he showed me his, and I couldn't understand how he'd gotten at this answer. And he said, you kind of just have to trust me on this. I've published in this area. So he's taken a class, but he already has journal papers publishing in this area.
He's the expert, yeah. Right.
I'm learning it for the first time. And what I realized is that a lot of the students around me, it's not necessarily that they were, quote unquote, smarter. They just had more experience, and they had just been exposed. And into my second year, third year of graduate school, those differences in exposure had mostly evened out, and I was fine. I just had to get through that first term where, for example, I was taking linear algebra. I hadn't taken linear algebra at all in undergrad. It wasn't required at Ohio State as an undergrad. But several students in the graduate program, they'd taken multiple linear algebra classes. And all of us were in the same intro to linear algebra course. And the professor, they, of course, want to make it challenging for everyone. So it was challenging for those that had taken it before, and for me it was nearly impossible. So once I got over those things and realized it wasn't about intelligence, it was just exposure, and if I stuck with it, I'd be okay, I was able to kind of bounce back.
Well, Cullen, I love this story, and I love a lot of the points that you brought up throughout of how you work through these tough times. You have to not sulk and be upset about not being smart enough. You're absolutely right here. A lot of times it's just a difference of experience because everyone's coming from different backgrounds, from different places, and brings different things to the table. And you can't give up that first semester, that first year. And I think this goes for grad school, undergrad, whenever you have one of these big life transitions.
I totally agree. There's a quote or a saying in the African American church, new level, new devil. So yeah. I think that applies.
Absolutely. Well, it's been great to hear about one of these challenges, but we don't want to dwell on the struggles and failures. So Cullen, can you tell us next one of your own success stories, whether it was a big win or just a small victory that really meant a lot?
I'll give another one that's related to a failure. So my maybe second or third year on the faculty, I just had a real drought in funding of sorts where maybe 10 to 12 proposals in a row, all rejected. It was very trying as I'm looking at my career and thinking, well, if I can't raise funding, I can't hire students. If I can't hire students and perform the research in the lab, we're not going to produce as many papers. If we don't produce papers, I'm not going to get good letters. If I don't get good letters, I'm not going to get tenure. If I don't get tenure,
it's a downward spiral. Yeah.
Yeah. I was going through one of those downward spirals that it's easy to get yourself into. But really, it was my faith that helped me persevere just in realizing that if I'm going to give up this easy, then maybe I'm not meant to do it. And I just resolved that I'm not going to give up. And I remember distinctly one day, essentially being in a small group and confessing to some fellow faculty that I'd been really struggling with funding and that I was really feeling challenged, but that I was going to really rely on God and rely on my faith and just really trust. I mean, the Bible talks a lot about trusting in God, and that's easy to say. It's much harder to do in practice. And if I were really trusting in God, then my mind wouldn't automatically go to this worst case scenario, because if I really trust in him and believe that he loves me, then my life is going to be okay. If I don't get tenure, then there's something else out there for me. It's not the end of the world. And maybe more importantly, usually you get anxious. So I mentioned earlier, I can be an anxious person. Mm-hmm. Often you get anxious because you think you know how your life is supposed to go. I thought I knew what was supposed to happen. Well, I'm supposed to receive these particular grants so that I can have this level of funding so that I can do X, Y, Z. And if you're going to have faith, you have to realize part of that is realizing you don't know how things are supposed to go. I distinctly remember the day I resolved to myself that I am not going to worry about this and I'm going to trust. That day, I got an email about a grant I had recently applied to. And it was funny because the grant read in the beginning, it said something to the effect of, actually, it was the DARPA Young Faculty Award. It was, thank you for applying for this grant. We received X number of applications. It was like 300 or something. Mm-hmm. And only 10% were funded. It basically was reading like a rejection letter. And then it said, congratulations. Oh, wow. You've been awarded. And it was funny because I had read so many rejections that when I read the first sentence or two, my heart kind of sank. I was like, oh, well, I'm used to this. Mm-hmm. And then I kept reading and it was actually an acceptance. But it was just interesting how I essentially made this spiritual change inside. And I do feel as if God rewarded me a little bit in the sense of saying, yeah, that's how you should be thinking. And just to let you know, I'm going to send this to you today. I don't believe in accidents. You mentioned all those people that I've met who had an influence on my career. None of those things are accidents to me. It seems too orchestrated to be an accident, but that's my perspective.
Well, Cullen, thank you so much for sharing this success. And I love the emotional roller coaster of you reading it like, oh, disappointment. And then, wait, hold on.
Yeah, if it would have been a letter, I might have started ripping it up.
Right. Well, I think you brought up such a good point that I think so many scientists struggle with, and that's being comfortable or accepting uncertainty. I think there's so much uncertainty in science right now with funding, with jobs, with all these different areas. And it's just something you have to be comfortable with it. You have to find your own way to cope with it, whatever that might be.
I absolutely agree. And something that maybe it's come out in this interview already, hopefully it's been clear. I mean, my faith is central to all of this. And I've been telling myself something the last few years. So I'm on the tenure track. I'm an associate professor, but I'm actually being evaluated for tenure now. So I don't have it. And that can be a stressful time in academics career. But a principle I've tried to live by is really living and acting as if I have tenure now. Actually, the concept I use is I have tenure in heaven. And what I mean by that is if I believe what the Bible says, then the most important things in life, salvation, those things are already done. No amount of journal papers or publications or funding or graduated students or awards, those things are just icing on the cake. The real security that I'm looking for, it's already been done. And so it takes the edge off of all of this uncertainty. I don't want to make light of it. The uncertainty these days around science is very real. But to me, if God is still in control, then I can have faith moving forward that things will be okay ultimately. But that doesn't mean that you take a passive kind of view of life, like, well, I don't need to do anything. God is just going to do it.
Right.
That's not what I'm saying. You work as if it depends on you, but deep down you realize that it doesn't. And so in my opinion, it takes the edge off a bit. It's allowed me to try to go through the tenure process with energy and with concern, but trying to lower the anxiety level a little bit, because to me, it's clear from my story that there's a plan for my life. And if it turns out that it's not tenure at MIT, it just means that it's something else. It doesn't mean it's the end of the world. And I actually wouldn't trade my time for anything. I've had a tremendous time here thus far, and I've enjoyed every step along the way, whether that's going to be this is the end of it or if I have 30 more years.
Well, me and our listeners, I'm sure, join me here in wishing you well on your tenure review that's ongoing. And I know we've talked about a lot of different aspects of your career and of your life. And one of the things that I do love to chat about is reading. I think this is hard to carve time out of your life as a scientist when you've got so much going on to do a little reading for fun. But I love getting book recommendations from everyone we have on our show. So, Cullen, is there a book that you've read that you really enjoyed and want to pass on to our listeners as a recommendation?
I'm reading a book right now. It's called Kingdom Calling. It's essentially a higher view of work. We live in a society that we've elevated work almost to maybe a God with a little g. As an example, when you ask someone what's your passion or what's your calling, they almost always mention vocation. I actually think my calling is more than just being a professor. I mean, I'm a father of 3. I'm a husband. They are integral to my quote unquote calling. But this book is very inspiring in that it gives an outline for work that is maybe even higher than our modern view of it, as something that's central to kind of how God views us. And it's something that is good, but it can be something that can be, I guess, redeeming for the world. It's a different view on work than I think you hear traditionally in the world, just in media or in church. It's a Christian view, but it's even different from what you would typically hear behind the pulpit. So I think it could be challenging from anyone's perspective to take a look at it.
Well, it's awesome to hear what you're reading right now, and we will put that on our website for our listeners to find if they are in search of their next good read. And we've talked a little bit about the different places you have gone throughout your career for training, and I think travel is such an integral part of life as a scientist. So, Cullen, when you think back on all the places that science has taken you, is there one place that jumps up in your mind as just your favorite place?
A few years ago, there's a conference that happens in my field of microfluidics that occurs in Italy. That was just a great trip. It was a great location. This particular time, I flew into Rome, and a friend of mine, his brother lived in Rome. And so I got to hang out in Rome with his brother. So I kind of had a little bit of a local flavor. And then I took the train up to the conference, which was maybe an hour away from Pisa. It was kind of in the mountains, but just in a beautiful setting. And the conference itself, it was a Gordon Research Conference. And Gordon Research Conferences tend to be a little smaller, so 200-300 people tops. And there's only one session. So it's not like one of those big society meetings where there are 15 parallel sessions. There's only one session. So everybody goes, everybody's in the room, everybody gets to know each other. It was great for me professionally and personally just to get to know the people that I've been reading their journal articles for years, but to get to know them one-on-one. And then just to see a lot of really good science. It's one of my favorite conferences. I'm actually vice chair for the next one. So I'm now volunteering with the group to help keep it going because I feel like it's just a great meeting.
Well, that's awesome. And I think these smaller meetings are such a great opportunity because by being with these same people in every session, every day across the meeting, you really get to know them and actually have time for conversations instead of everyone running off in different directions.
Exactly. And the problem with the big meeting is I don't know what the threshold is, but maybe it's around 500 to 1,000 people. Once you get to around that size, you lose motivation to try to meet people, and then you just look for the people that you already know. And so after the session, you go and look for the friends that you know are there. You just have dinner or lunch with them. Whereas at this smaller meeting, because you could actually get to know 200 people in a week, you could have a conversation with most everyone. I find you explore a little bit more.
Because it's not overwhelming. Yeah.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned you were able to spend some time in Rome as well. Is there one thing that you saw when you were in Rome that really sticks as a strong memory?
Rome is just an amazing city because you have all this history woven right in with modern Rome. So you're walking through the center of the city and it's like the Colosseum, and then there's office buildings next to it. It's just really surreal to have all that history woven right in. I do remember, though, visiting a site. It was a prison where it's claimed that the Apostle Paul, who wrote the majority of the New Testament and the Bible, was actually imprisoned there. And it was like you kind of crawled down in this hole, and I don't know, it was kind of surreal to feel like I was walking in the steps of one of the apostles of Christianity. But that hole that he was in and that site definitely stick out to me as one of the more memorable moments of my time in Rome.
Definitely. And I think these opportunities to travel for science do give you the opportunity to see areas of the world that you would maybe not otherwise make it to.
Oh, science is awesome for that. There's so much that I've seen that I would have never seen if it weren't for science. I was in a conference in Hawaii. I highly recommend conferences in Hawaii. Just go.
I highly just recommend Hawaii. Yeah.
Well, I had never been before. And for the most part, a trip to Hawaii would be financially just difficult for me. But then there's a conference in my area and I got invited to give a talk there. And I loved Hawaii. I've been to Brazil for research. I've been to London for research. I've come to appreciate travel, and the more interesting travel that I've ever done has been science related. I've been to Russia, been a lot of places.
Very cool. And I know in addition to these opportunities to travel, you do have opportunities to work with wonderful people. We've mentioned a couple of them already. And I think it's funny to meet different people in science and learn a little bit more about the personalities of everyone. I think there's often stereotypes of what scientists or engineers are like. There's jokes about them and whatever, but so many people don't fit that mold that you get to work with. So do you have a story that you can share with us today, Cullen, of maybe a quirky tradition or just a funny memory that maybe takes us outside of those stereotypes of scientists and engineers?
So with my lab groups, I like to do social outings. And a couple months ago, we decided to go to essentially a karaoke bar. It was awesome.
Are you a good singer?
Me? I'm okay. I don't know if I'd say good.
Yeah.
I'm okay. I can hold a note and I know when I'm off. I'm not very good. But it was just shocked to see this other side of the members of my research group. Music is just one of those things that almost everyone loves. Mm-hmm. It's hard to meet someone who says, like, yeah, I don't like music. It's right. More so when you meet someone, it's like, what type of music do you like? It's assumed that you like music. So tell us which type it is. So it was fun to hang out with them and see this other side of the members of my research group.
Do you think you guys will go again?
Oh, we're definitely going again.
Yeah.
It's going to be a staple. It was just too much fun. And of course, you add a little bit of alcoholic lubrication and it becomes not just singing, but also dancing. And
of course.
Then it gets really interesting.
Inhibition goes out the window. Yeah. Our group has done karaoke a couple times before, and it is a lot of fun. So fantastic to hear about this excellent outing that your group has gone on. And I'm glad to hear that it wasn't so terrible that you are going to actually do it again. So. Oh,
no, we're definitely doing it again. I can't wait. Maybe after I find out the result of my tenure case, we'll go out karaoke bar again.
Celebratory karaoke.
Exactly.
Well, now, Cullen, I know we've talked about some of the fantastic questions that you're answering in your lab today, but I'm curious, if I gave you everything, if funding wasn't a problem, resources, technology, staff, any of the things that normally stand in our way, what is the one question that you would want to answer?
I'll be honest, I'm not exactly sure what the one question would be. What I can say is if I were to put resources, it would be towards minimizing and eliminating human suffering to the greatest extent possible. So something like 500,000 children per year die from lack of clean water. Hundreds of thousands, maybe millions die of malaria and HIV. If I were going to pick one thing, I would put those resources to bear on aspects of our world or problems that are leading to the most casualty and most suffering. I think in practical terms, you look at what you've been trained in. So I've been trained as a mechanical engineer and specifically a lot of transport phenomena, so fluid mechanics and heat transfer and mass transfer at the micro scale. And so in my own research, I try to pick problems that integrate those skills, but then also have a high impact. If I had infinite resources, I would, irrespective of my own training, I would look for the areas where there's the most suffering and try to make an impact on those. And my guess is it's going to be something like malaria or HIV or clean water that, if you look globally, is causing just a lot of calamity. And now one challenge with those things also is those problems are in many ways perhaps not just technology. I think technology can get elevated to a status of thinking it's going to save the world, quote unquote. And technology can be a part of the solution, but many of these problems are sociological and political in addition to technological. So I have to keep that in mind as well.
Absolutely. I think the scientific solution is only part of it. You have all these other pieces of a culture that you have to integrate it with. So thanks for dreaming big with us today, Cullen. I think this is a fantastic goal, or an area almost, to tackle some of these huge global public health challenges that we're facing today. And I'm curious, we've talked about some of the people who've had an impact on you over your career. Is there one piece of advice you remember receiving that really helped you that you want to pass on to our listeners today?
I remember being in a seminar for graduate students that were considering academic jobs. And Richard Zare, who's a chemist at Stanford, reasonably famous, pretty famous chemist, he gave some advice to the students that I still think about. He said, it's not problem solving, it's problem picking. And then he explained that most of us, if given a problem, you can find a solution to it. If there's a solution, the people in this room or the people listening are probably smart enough to find it. But what really distinguishes you is picking the right problem to embark on in the first place. And that just always stuck with me, and putting a lot of time into what problem are you going to try to solve. So it's not problem solving, it's problem picking.
I like it. And I think that's great advice for young scientists out there who are embarking on their careers. Choosing the right, quote unquote, problem to solve can have a huge impact on your career, and maybe knowing when to walk away from a problem that's really just not going anywhere.
Oh, yeah, that's always one. When to let it go.
Yeah.
It's like breaking up.
Right. It's not you, it's me problem. Yeah. So, Cullen, is there any other last piece of advice you want to leave our listeners with today?
I would urge people to consider the big questions in life. Personally, I think the big questions in life, they permeate into everything that we do. And what do I mean by big questions? Big questions like, why am I here? What is my motivation? Personally, I would add the question, what happens after you die? Is there a God? Because we all have a worldview, and that worldview really permeates everything that we do. It's really easy in our kind of postmodern era to say that, and I believe this, and to some extent, that you can have your worldview and I can have mine, and we can live in harmony together. So I totally agree with that. But I think sometimes our society, what we say is, oh, well, you can have your worldview and I can have mine. And it doesn't really matter. What really matters is something else. But I disagree, because if you really want to be successful and happy in life, that worldview, that lens that you look through is going to have a tremendous influence on that. And I'll just give one really quick personal example, and then that'll be it. And it's just this recent example of me with, for example, with tenure. If I believed that this world were all that there is and that my success in this world were paramount to my happiness, then going through tenure or any stage, going through qualifying exams as a Ph.D. student, defending your Ph.D. or any number of professional hurdles that you might have, those things go from important things to ultimate things. And this is what leads to academic misconduct. This is what leads to unfortunate cases where people's mental health leads them to bad outcomes, partially because you've taken something that's a good thing, your career, and it becomes an ultimate thing. And that's all worldview. If your worldview is that this is kind of all that there is, then maybe your career is the ultimate thing. And maybe you should sacrifice everything, including your family and your health and all of your relationships for it. But if that's not the case, then it's helpful to think on those things before you get put into the stressful situation. And I find as a professor, I meet undergraduates and graduate students and colleagues, and most people don't think on these questions until they're thrust into it. They get a terminal illness, or they get a bad grade, or a family member passes away. And then they start to question, well, why am I here? What am I doing? And it's much easier to think on those questions before you're in that situation. So I recommend taking some time to think on those bigger questions around motivation in life before it's critical, because it actually does have an effect on your day-to-day life. And then you'll also be prepared for those really stressful, really challenging situations that we unfortunately all face down the line.
Definitely. Well, Cullen, thank you so much for sharing this message with our listeners. I think you're right. It is so easy to get wrapped up in kind of the day-to-day grind that you don't take the time to step back and reflect on these bigger questions. So thank you so much for sharing that. Can you tell our listeners how they can reach out or find you if they want to learn more about you and your work?
Unfortunately, my name is terribly Googleable, if that is an adjective, Googleable.
We're going to make it one today.
Yeah, so if you Google search me, you will certainly find me. But my email address is really easy. It's crb@mit.edu. So it rhymes, crb@MIT. Or you could just Google me, and you could actually find talks where I've at length talked about my motivation through the Veritas Forum. There are also some technical lectures, and you can find journal papers if you Google me. But of course, you could also email me, crb@MIT.
Perfect. Well, listeners, definitely get in touch if you have any questions. And Cullen, it's been a pleasure today. Thank you so much for sharing a piece of your story.
No problem. Thank you.
And listeners, thank you for joining us as well. We'll see you next time on another episode of People Behind the Science. Your voyage to explore the lives of today's exceptional scientists has just begun. You can find everything we talked about today, including our guests' favorite books, biographies, photos, and more, when you visit us at www.peoplebehindthescience.com. I look forward to chatting with you next time on People Behind the Science.